so they don't hurt him too much. But we were starting out, and it wouldn't have helped us any, which has proven because we did all right without him.
Yeah, you did terrific without him.
For nearly 50 years, a small leather journal sat hidden in a dusty box, holding secrets nobody knew existed, written by the one man who watched Elvis Presley up close during his very last week alive, a quiet hotel manager who noticed everything and said nothing until now. What did he see behind those closed doors? Join us as we uncover the truth inside those pages. The journal that was never meant to be seen. It was tucked away inside a storage box that had not been opened in decades, buried under old receipts, faded photographs, and forgotten paperwork, sitting quietly at the bottom like it had always been there, like it was waiting for the right moment to be found. A small leather-bound journal, the kind that was never meant to leave the room it was written in, never meant to be read by anyone except the man who filled those pages with his own hand. That man was a hotel manager, a quiet and careful professional who had spent his whole career working behind a front desk, greeting guests, solving problems, and keeping the kind of secrets that come naturally with that kind of job. He was not famous, not someone the world had ever heard of, just a man who noticed things and wrote those things down at the end of each day. For nearly 50 years, that journal sat in silence. Then, it surfaced, and everything changed. Because this was not just any journal about any ordinary guest. These pages held the private, first-hand observations of a man who had been present during one of the most talked-about final weeks in all of music history. A man who had watched, listened, and quietly written everything down with no audience in mind, no book deal waiting, no fame to chase, just honest words on plain paper, written by someone who had no idea how important those words would one day become. The journal documented the week Elvis Presley spent at his hotel, right before the world lost him forever. The entries were not dramatic or over the top. They were simply the unfiltered thoughts of a working man who had checked in a legend and had no way of knowing at the time that the legend would soon be gone. When word spread that the journal had been found, the reaction came fast. Fans wanted to know what was inside, historians wanted to verify it, and journalists wanted to understand why it had stayed hidden for so long. The answer to that last question turned out to be just as moving as the entries themselves. The manager had kept it private on purpose, not out of shame, not out of fear, but out of a deep and quiet respect for what he had witnessed. Something that felt too human and too fragile to hand over to the world while he was still alive. But now, the world finally has it. And what those pages reveal begins with something that looked, on the surface, completely ordinary. A guest arriving at a hotel, a routine check-in. Nothing unusual at all, except it was anything but routine. A routine check-in. That felt different. The lobby was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet that settles into a hotel on an ordinary weekday. When the morning rush has long faded and the evening crowd has not yet arrived, when staff move through their routines without much urgency, and everything feels calm and unhurried and still, then the doors opened. Even before anyone looked up, something shifted in the room. A change in energy that was hard to explain, but impossible to ignore. A slight pause in the ordinary rhythm of the afternoon. And then, there he was, Elvis Presley, stepping through the lobby and moving toward the front desk with the kind of quiet presence that needed no announcement and no introduction. The manager had seen famous faces before. That was simply part of the job. And after enough years in the industry, the initial shock of celebrity tended to wear off. You learn to stay calm, to treat every guest with the same steady, professional courtesy, no matter who they were or how big their name happened to be. But the manager later wrote that this particular arrival felt different from the very first second, and not in the way he expected. It was not the fame that caught him off guard, not the name on the reservation or the size of the group that came through the doors with him. It was something else entirely, something in the way Elvis looked that afternoon, something underneath all the star power and the familiar face that the whole world knew so well. Elvis looked exhausted, not the kind of tired that comes from a long trip or a late night, but something much deeper and much harder to name. A heaviness that seemed to live somewhere far beneath the surface, in his eyes, in the slow and careful way he moved, in the set of his shoulders as he crossed the lobby floor. The check-in itself went smoothly, keys were handed over, pleasantries were exchanged. Every visible part of the interaction was exactly what it was supposed to be. But the staff felt it too. A low and quiet unease that lingered in the lobby long after Elvis had stepped into the elevator and disappeared from view. That evening, the manager sat down, opened his journal, and began writing in careful, unhurried detail about everything he had seen and everything he had felt during that arrival, with no idea that he was beginning a record that would one day mean so much to so many people. The manager who noticed everything. Not everyone who works a front desk pays close attention. Some people simply do the job, check the boxes, move through the shift, and go home without a second thought. But this manager was different. He had always been different, and the people who worked alongside him knew it. He had spent years in the hospitality industry, building a reputation as someone who was thorough, composed, and quietly sharp. The kind of professional who remembered a returning guest's preferences without being reminded, who could sense a problem in a room before it was ever reported, who noticed the small things that most people simply walked past without a second glance. He kept a personal journal, not because anyone asked him to, not because he thought his observations were important enough to preserve, but because writing helped him process the world around him. It was a private habit, something he had done for years, filling page after page with details about his days, his guests, the quiet rhythms of hotel life that most people never thought twice about. He had hosted celebrities before, plenty of them. Musicians and actors and politicians had all passed through his lobby at one point or another. And while he always treated those moments with professionalism and discretion, very few of them had moved him enough to write about at any real length. Elvis was different from the moment he arrived. There was something about the way the king carried himself that week that stayed with the manager long after each interaction ended. It was the kind of feeling that is difficult to shake because it does not come from anything obvious or dramatic. It comes from instinct, from years of reading people and knowing when something is quietly, deeply off. That first night, the manager wrote a long entry about Elvis's arrival, longer than usual, more detailed than he typically bothered with, going back over small moments and gestures that he had noticed during the check-in, the heaviness behind the eyes, the way the energy around him felt muted and subdued compared to what the manager had expected from someone of his stature and fame. He did not know why he felt compelled to write so much that night. It just felt necessary, like something in him understood, even then, that these observations mattered, that they deserved to be recorded carefully and honestly. What he would write over the days that followed would only grow more detailed, more concerned, and far more difficult to read. Small moments that raised concern. The days settled into a pattern, and it was the pattern itself that began to trouble the manager most. Not any single dramatic incident, not one moment that could be pointed to and named, but the quiet, accumulating weight of small things that did not quite add up to the picture the world had of Elvis Presley. The journal entries from those middle days of the week were careful and measured, written in the manager's usual unhurried style. But underneath the calm surface of the language, there was something uneasy, a growing sense that the man behind the closed hotel room door was not doing well. Elvis was spending long hours alone. That much became clear early on. The kind of long hours that go beyond rest or privacy. The kind that staff notice because the do not disturb sign stays on too long and the silence from a room feels heavier than it should. Room service orders came through late at night, well past the hours when most guests had long settled in for the evening. Quiet orders, nothing extravagant, the kind of requests that speak more to restlessness than to appetite. The staff whispered among themselves, carefully and quietly, the way hotel staff always do when something feels wrong, but nothing can be confirmed. They had all noticed the same things independently, the stillness around his floor, the way he moved through the corridors when he did appear, slowly and without the kind of energy that his name and his legend seemed to promise. The manager wrote about one particular afternoon when Elvis was spotted sitting alone in a common area of the hotel, not speaking to anyone, not on the phone, not reading, just sitting quietly with his thoughts in a way that felt less like relaxation, and more like a man carrying something very heavy somewhere deep inside himself. There was no way to intervene, no professional reason to knock on a guest's door and ask if they were all right, simply because they seemed sad or tired or distant. Hospitality does not work that way, you observe. You remain available, and you respect the privacy of the people in your care, no matter what your instincts are quietly telling you. But the manager kept writing it all down. Every small detail, every staff observation passed along in hushed tones at the front desk. every late-night order logged in the system that made him pause and think a little longer than usual. The entries were getting heavier with each passing day, and then came the evening that the manager would spend the rest of his life turning over in his mind. A private conversation the manager never forgot. It happened on an otherwise unremarkable evening. The lobby was calm. The staff were moving through their usual routines, and the manager was finishing up some paperwork near the front desk when he heard the elevator doors open and looked up to find Elvis walking slowly down the corridor toward him, alone, no entourage, no security hovering nearby, just a man in a quiet hallway at the end of a long day. The manager straightened up and offered a polite, professional greeting, the way he always did with guests, expecting nothing more than a nod in return, the kind of brief, wordless exchange that happens 100 times in a hotel on any given evening. But Elvis slowed his pace and stopped, and for a moment, the two men simply stood together in the corridor with the low hum of the hotel all around them. What followed was a short conversation. Not long, not dramatic, not the kind of exchange that would have seemed significant to anyone passing by, but the manager wrote about it in more detail than almost anything else in the entire journal, going back over every word, every pause, every small gesture, because something about the way Elvis spoke that evening lodged itself deep into his memory and never left. Elvis was reflective. That was the word the manager used more than once in his entry about that night. Reflective in a way that felt heavier than nostalgia, the way a person speaks when they're looking back at their life from a distance, weighing it quietly and honestly without any performance or pretense. There was no celebrity in the corridor that evening, just a man talking in the soft, unhurried way of someone who had been alone with their thoughts for too long. The manager listened, responded gently, kept the exchange easy and unforced the way his years of experience had taught him to do. But inside he felt something shift, a quiet, uncomfortable feeling that he could not name at the time and struggled to put into words even later when he sat down to write about it. He described the conversation as haunting, not because of anything frightening that was said, but because of the feeling it left behind, the sense that something in Elvis's words carried a weight that only made full sense in the terrible days that followed. The manager wrote that he thought about that hallway conversation for decades afterwards, turning it over and over, wondering if there was something he had missed, something he could have done, some response that might have made any difference at all. There was one more thing he noticed before that week came to its end. The week that felt like a storm, approaching. There is a particular kind of dread that builds slowly, not all at once, not in a single moment of clarity, but gradually, quietly. The way dark clouds gather on a horizon long before the rain actually arrives. And that is exactly how the manager described the feeling that settled over him during the latter half of that week, a feeling he could not shake no matter how hard he tried to focus on the ordinary demands of his job. The journal entries from those days read differently from the earlier ones. The language was the same, calm and careful and measured, but something underneath had changed. There was a tension running through each page that had not been there at the start of the week, a growing unease that the manager seemed unable to fully explain even to himself as he sat down each evening to write. Elvis's behavior had become harder to read, swinging between moments that felt almost like the old familiar Elvis, charming and warm and present, and other moments where he seemed to disappear entirely into himself, distant and unreachable in a way that unsettled everyone around him. The staff had stopped whispering and started simply watching, quietly and carefully, the way people do when they sense that something is coming, but cannot say what it is. The manager documented all of it, the good moments alongside the troubling ones, the brief flashes of warmth and humor that reminded everyone why the whole world loved this man, followed closely by the long silences and the heavy fatigue that seemed to pull him back down each time. It was that contrast more than anything else that stayed with the manager, the distance between who Elvis had been and who he seemed to be in those final days of the stay. He wrote about the atmosphere on Elvis's floor of the hotel, describing it as unusually still, the kind of stillness that presses against you rather than that comforts you. Staff moved through their duties up there with a kind of careful quietness that nobody had instructed them to use. It had simply developed on its own, organically, the way people naturally lower their voices around something fragile. The manager wrote in one entry that the whole week felt like a storm that was taking too long to arrive, pressure building in the air around everyone without any release, without any explanation, without anything he could point to and name out loud. He had no idea how soon that storm would finally break, and he had no idea that the last time he would see Elvis was now just hours away. The last time the manager saw Elvis. Nobody ever knows in the moment it is happening that they are experiencing something for the last time. That is the particular cruelty of final moments. They almost never announce themselves. They arrive dressed as ordinary everyday interactions, unremarkable and forgettable on the surface. And it is only later, sometimes much later, that their true weight becomes impossible to ignore. The manager's last interaction with Elvis was exactly like that. Small and quiet and over in less than a minute. The kind of brief exchange that happens dozens of times every day in a busy hotel. So routine that under any other circumstances, it would not have been worth noting at all. Elvis was crossing the lobby, moving toward the exit with the slow, unhurried pace that the manager had come to recognize over the course of that week. And as he passed the front desk, he glanced over and gave a small nod, polite and understated. The kind of acknowledgement that says I see you without asking for anything in return, and the manager nodded back, professional and calm. As always, and that was it. That what was all there was. A few seconds of quiet recognition between two people. And then Elvis was gone, through the doors and out into the world beyond the lobby. The manager wrote about that moment in detail that night, even though there was almost nothing to describe. And the fact that he felt compelled to write about something so brief and so ordinary is itself revealing, because it suggests that somewhere beneath the surface of his professional composure, something had registered. Some quiet instinct had filed that moment away as significant before his conscious mind had caught up with why. He used a phrase in that entry that would later become one of the most talked about lines in the entire journal, writing that Elvis looked tired in a way he had never seen before. Not tired the way he had looked on the first day of his arrival, not the deep fatigue of a man who needed rest, but something further along than that. Something that sat in a different place entirely and was much harder to describe with ordinary words. The manager closed his journal that night, set it on the table beside his bed the way he always did, and went to sleep without knowing that everything was about to change, without knowing that the next time he would open those pages, it would be with hands that were no longer steady. What he was about to learn would send him straight back to every word he had written that week. The news that changed everything. The news came the way devastating news so often does, suddenly and without warning, cutting through an ordinary day like something sharp and cold, leaving behind a silence that takes a long time to fill back up with anything that feels real or steady or right. The manager heard about Elvis's death the way most people did, not from anyone who had been there, not from a phone call or a personal message, but from the kind of urgent, disbelieving announcement that spreads through the world in waves when something enormous and unthinkable has just happened, and his first reaction, like so many people's, was the instinctive refusal that comes before understanding, the part of the mind that pushes back before it accepts. But acceptance came, and when it did, it brought something with it that most people grieving the loss of Elvis did not have to carry. Because most people had not spent the previous week watching him move through a hotel lobby, had not stood with him in a quiet corridor, had not written down their private observations about the heaviness behind his eyes and the deep, unnameable exhaustion that had seemed to follow him like a shadow through every hour of that final stay. The manager went to his journal. He sat down and read back through every entry he had written that week, from the first one about the arrival in the lobby all the way through to the last one about that small, quiet nod at the front desk, and reading them now in the terrible light of what had just happened. It was a completely different experience from writing them had been. Every observation that had seemed merely concerning at the time now felt unbearably significant. Every careful note about Elvis's fatigue and distance and reflective sadness now carried a weight that pressed down on every single word. He wrote a new entry that day, longer and more raw than anything else in the journal, working through what he had seen and what he felt and what it meant to have been so close to something so enormous without understanding it fully until it was already over. It was not a polished piece of writing. It was the honest, unguarded outpouring of a man in shock, trying to make sense of something that resisted any easy sense-making. That entry, more than any other, explained what the journal truly was, not a record of celebrity gossip or behind-the-scenes drama, but the quiet testimony of an ordinary man who had witnessed something deeply human and deeply sad, and yet For nearly 50 years, he chose to keep every single word of it completely to himself. And the reason why is more moving than most people would ever expect. Why the journal stayed hidden for decades. The manager never spoke publicly about what he had witnessed, not in the weeks after Elvis died, not in the months that followed, not in the years that slowly turned into decades, while the rest of the world continued to process the loss of the king of rock and roll in every way imaginable, through tribute concerts and documentaries and books and television specials and countless interviews with anyone who had ever spent 5 minutes in the same room as him. There was no shortage of people willing to talk, willing to sell their memories and their moments and their secondhand stories to anyone who would listen. And the manager understood that he did not judge it. People grieve in different ways and remember in different ways, and some people genuinely believed that sharing brought comfort to themselves and to the fans who were still hurting. But he was not that kind of person, and what he had written was not that kind of document. He had made a decision early on, quietly and without any drama, that the journal would stay locked away for as long as he was alive. And the reasoning behind that decision said everything about the kind of man he was, because it had nothing to do with protecting himself or avoiding attention or fearing how the story might be received. It came entirely from his deep and genuine respect for what he had seen during that final week. What he had witnessed was private. That was the word he kept returning to. Private in the truest sense, not secret or scandalous or hidden for any calculated reason, but simply belonging to a space that felt too intimate and too human to expose to the noise and the hunger of a world that had always struggled to see Elvis as anything other than a legend, a symbol, an icon larger than any single ordinary life. The manager had seen something different. He had seen a man, tired and reflective and quietly struggling, moving through the last days of his life with a kind of fragile humanity that deserved to be protected rather than packaged and sold. And every time the thought of publication crossed his mind over the years, he came back to that same feeling, the sense that releasing those pages while the world was still so loud and so hungry would be a betrayal of something he had been trusted with, even if that trust had never been spoken out loud between them. So the journal stayed where it was, tucked away in its box, holding its quiet truth in the dark for decade after decade, waiting patiently for the world to be ready for the only story it had ever wanted to tell. It's the emotional truth inside those pages. Now that the journal has finally come to light, the first thing that strikes anyone who reads through its pages carefully is what is not there, because what is not there turns out to matter just as much as what is. There is no scandal hiding between the lines, no explosive revelation designed to reshape the way the world understands Elvis Presley, no dramatic secret that changes the story everyone already knows. What is there is something quieter, and in many ways far more powerful than any of that. The journal is, at its heart, a portrait of loneliness, drawn slowly and carefully over the course of a single week by a man who had no agenda and nothing to gain, who was simply watching and feeling and writing honestly about what was right in front of him, and what was right in front of him was a human being carrying an almost unbearable weight, exhausted in a way that went far beyond the physical, searching for something in the quiet spaces between all the noise and the fame and the expectations that had followed him everywhere for his entire adult life. The manager's observations strip away the legend and leave behind the person. And that turns out to be an unexpectedly moving thing to witness, because the person who emerges from these pages is someone that even the most devoted fans may not have fully seen before. Not the performer, not the icon, not the king, just a man who seemed, in those final days, to be looking for a kind of peace that had always stayed just out of reach. There are entries that are genuinely difficult to read now, not because they are graphic or sensational, but because they are so tender and so honest. Small observations about a tired man moving quietly through a hotel that feel, in the light of everything that followed, like the most human thing in the world. The manager spent nearly 50 years carrying the weight of what he had seen, choosing silence out of respect rather than indifference, protecting something fragile because he believed it deserved to be protected. And in doing so, he preserved something that no newspaper headline or televised tribute ever could. A still, honest, unguarded glimpse at the very last chapter of a life that had burned brighter than almost any other in the history of popular music. The world lost Elvis far too soon. That much has never been in dispute. But thanks to one quiet man and his leather-bound journal, the world now has something it never expected to find. One final, tender look at the man behind the myth in the last week he ever lived.